Hey, it's Drybear. Today I want to talk about crafting for Last Epoch. We're kind of at that point where a lot of people are deep into endgame and they're like, trying to exploring their own systems, whether they're new to Last Epoch or not. And I think it's worthy just to do a guide going over the ins and outs of crafting, how crafting works, the combinations you can use to create great items, and also the restrictions. There are things that are in the game that aren't super clear when you first start playing. And I think as is the case with Last Epoch, is generally the winning aspect of Last Epoch, at least in my mind, is the system design. They have very elegant systems with good innovative solutions, and they also, once you understand the system, are super fun to play around with because you have a lot of different knobs and dials to turn. All right, so we're gonna start from the top and work our way through. As always, we try to make sure that no one gets left behind in these sorts of guide videos. So in this case, let's start from the very top, and that is going to be the affixes. So on an item, you can even just show it to make it super simple. We know that we have affixes. These are the stats that exist on an item, and there are tons of stats you can choose from. There are a lot of restrictions on those, but let's walk through the idea of affixes on items so at least everyone's on the same page. So when you look at an item, there are going to be 2 prefixes and 2 suffixes. All that means is it's legacy from old school Diablo, where the name of an item would help you identify what the item is. So if you put it on the ground, I have simple names on for this, but it'll show like of the bear or of the hawk or of the chicken taco, and that'll tell you that if it's of the chicken taco, it's probably spicy and delicious. So you have these different names that go with it, but you just need to know that for every item, there can be a maximum of 2 prefixes and 2 suffixes. And these will all be different stats depending on the item itself, and they will have different stats that they can roll when you're looking at them as well. And when you look at this, you can actually look at the list of prefixes and suffixes. So if you're in game, you can find resources online like Last Epoch tools or various other guide websites, or you can look at it in game as well. So if you click on your inventory screen here, crafting materials, you'll see that they have the full list of all the stats available in the game, and you'll notice that each of them is either a suffix or a prefix. Generally, offense is a prefix and defense is suffix, though not always, and it'll tell you kind of what stats can go onto an item. So when you look at an item and it has movement speed on it, or main stat on it, or resistance, health regeneration, ward retention, things like that, that can change a great deal about the item itself, but that's kind of what you're playing around with. So you have your first tier of crafting, which goes on blue, yellow, or purple items that will allow you to mess around with the affixes that exist on these items. Now, if you look at an item like this with your default view, it'll look like this. You'll have your 2 prefixes and suffixes. There's tons of different things you could do to show the description of these, and you can change around the button hotkeys for these as well. So if you go to your settings and you go to gameplay and you scroll down to the stats for items, you can actually mess around with swap mod rages to mod explanations, or always showed mod rages. I actually just like checking both of these because what it'll do is it'll show you the full view on an item. You'll notice that it'll tell you what tier the item or the stat is itself and the range that it goes to. So there are 7 tiers total for stats. They go tier 1 all the way up to tier 7. Tier 5 is the max craftable, which you'll see written on the item here. This is different than some other ARPGs where they allow a full range to exist. In this game, to make things a little bit cleaner and more fair, anything above tier 5 cannot be crafted on an item in the normal sense. There are ways to get those on other items, but in general, if you're looking for a tier 6 or a tier 7, an exalted affix, you will have to drop that on an item that you find out in the world that'll come with that as well. So you're looking for those kinds of items to show up with those stats on them. So you're looking for that as a primary. You'll notice that when you go to craft, it'll show a tier 1, T2, T3, T4, tier 5 all the way up to tier 7 on this. So the best in slot is going to be tier 7 with the maximum value that that slot can provide. Now, in the range of normal items, you have the normal rarity here, which has no affixes on it. Then you have the blue rarity, which will have 1 or 2 affixes on it. You can get the yellow rarity, which can have 2 to 4 affixes on it. And above yellow is going to be your exalted, and that's going to be this purple one here, which gives you even more options for for the scaled up value of those affixes in general. And those are the ones you're going to be using while leveling, unless you find a good unique that scales with it. You're going to be running with one of those rarities that has 4 slots for stats, and then you'll be able to craft to those as you move along through the story. Now, if we pick up an item, like say let's grab this item here, this is a blue quality. If we put this in the crafting slot, you'll notice that it only has 2 suffixes. It has no prefixes on it, which is where your crafting journey begins in Last Epoch. Because if there are no affixes in that slot, you have the freedom to add them and play around with them to create the item you're looking for. So when we have this blue item here that only has 2 suffixes, it has no prefixes on it, we can then go and add these prefixes to the item. So if we wanted to add crit strike multiplier, if we wanted to add damage over time, if we have a build that needs lightning damage, we can add that as an element. And the way you do this is through these affix shards. So if we go to that crafting material list that we looked at earlier that has all of your affixes on it, you'll notice in brackets, in like next to it, the amount of shards you have for that affix, and it'll cost a certain amount of shards to apply that affix to an empty slot on an item. So you get this in several different ways. The affix shards can drop randomly as rewards for various endgame activities, so you'll naturally start accruing these affix shards as you play through the game, but you can also collect more of these affix shards by finding an item that has the affix that you're looking for and dismantling it. And this is actually a confusing part for a lot of new players, because when you go here to get an item, say you want the ward per second affix shards for this item, or you want fire resistance or something, how do you dismantle it? I mean, I've seen a lot of new players come in, they click this in, they're like, what the frick? Like, there's no dismantle button. Can I go to the vendor and dismantle? Like, how do I actually dismantle items so I can get the affix shards to craft what I'm looking for? And that's easy. It's actually a specific crafting material that causes the item to be dismantled, and that is going to be this item here, the Rune of Shattering. So this is going to be your first introduction to the crafting modifier items that will change the outcome of the craft. This is going to be the first one you'll need to know about, because it is worth shattering some items as you go through the story, and then as you get into early endgame, you will be shattering quite a lot just to make sure you get the affix shards you need. And then as you start getting super late game, you'll probably have so many shards that you don't really need to do this as much anymore, but it is something to pay attention to. So all you have to do for an item, if you want to get the affix shards from that item for the stats that it has, you just go down here on the crafting window, press this, add in a Rune of Shattering, and it will destroy the item and give you shards, a random amount of shards for each of the affixes that are on that item. So that's how you start getting your affix shards in the beginning. If you need to get more Runes of Shattering, the easiest way while leveling is to buy them from vendors. Most gear vendors in the game will sell, every time they refresh their stock, they'll sell a certain number of Runes of Shattering. So you can actually just buy these for gold as you're progressing through the game until you start getting them regularly from reward caches and other bonuses, or bonuses from your Weaver tree. And by the way, if you're in like the end of time area, there's always going to be a forge somewhere that you can walk up to, but you can also just bring it up anywhere. I believe by default it's F. I have it bound to V, so I can bring it up, so I can use F for movement ability, for like, you know, moving around, that sort of thing. So you have this here. So how do you go about crafting? Let's go through the crafting process and the restrictions you have on it. Remove that extra piece there. The first thing that you're going to want to know about crafting is going to be about item potential. So when you look at an item, you'll notice that on the item at the bottom of the implicits, it has a forging potential on it. When you put it in the forge, it will have a listed forging potential. There are 3 different kinds of potential in Last Epoch, and they all determine how many more actions you can take on that item in order to make it better. Your allotted resource amount of doing things to the item to make it stronger. For non-unique items, you will get a forging potential, or FP by default, and everything that you do to that item will consume a random amount of forging potential. So there is RNG built into it. Yes, it is deterministic in many ways, but it is still RNG. You can brick an item by running out of forging potential. And there's also some restrictions we'll get into in a minute that will tell you that when an item has 0 forging potential, it locks you out from specific end game crafting options. So when you go to upgrade a stat up to T5, 5, the max craftable. If you go to add a stat to something, so let's grab like, I don't know, like elemental damage. Let's add elemental damage to this focus. When I do it, it's going to consume a random amount of forging potential. So you see down here, it costs 1 to 18 forging potential. I have 14 left, so this could very easily just brick the item and remove all forging potential remaining. We click it, and we ended up getting 10 cost for that. So we added a tier 1 elemental damage to this catalyst, and it cost us 10 forging potential. Now we have 4 left, so we could upgrade this if we wanted to, or add another stat, which would be a random cost of forging potential again. And once that hits 0, we'll be out. So if I add in mana here, you'll see that I did get mana on it. I have tier 1 of both, but now the item is completely out of forging potential. There's nothing I can do further on this. There's no forging potential remaining. And there's also some process, like I said, end game things that you can look at later that will end up, you know, you have to have at least 1 forging potential on the item, that sort of thing. So when the forging potential is out, that's it. You're done crafting on that item. The other 2 types of forging potential relate to uniques. One of them is brand new with this season, and one has existed for quite a while. So if you go to a unique item, so you'll see this item here, like we hover onto this unique item here, you'll see right under the implicit value where you would normally see forging potential. So if you look at this item here, you'll notice it has 41 forging potential listed at the bottom of the implicit stats underneath the basics of the item. This one has 41 forging potential, but we look at unique, and the unique itself has none. There's no forging potential. All uniques in Last Epoch will never have forging potential. Forging is only for non-unique items, but it doesn't mean you can't play around with unique items to make them stronger. Uniques themselves come with 2 different types of potential. So the first one here is going to be legendary potential. So you notice that unlike this unique, which has no potential, this unique has 2 legendary potential. You can even find uniques that will have multiples. So you see this one has 3 legendary potential, and you can have up to 4. So 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4 legendary potential, which allows you to craft those uniques to make them stronger. Now, depending on the item type, it will either have legendary potential or the brand new seasonal stat Weaver's potential, which has a chance to be better than legendary potential, but it's purely random. So again, this is a unique. You can see it's just like these. It has no potential. This one has 2 legendary potential on it, and this one has 18 Weaver's Will on it. Weaver's Will and legendary potential do the exact same thing in the end, and that is to make a unique item into a legendary item. So when you see an item go from the like deep rusty brown of unique to that like kind of you know, high saturation pink look, then it becomes a legendary item. And a legendary item is simply just a unique that has additional affixes on it. So you'll notice how this chest piece is a unique normally. If we go to the wings of Argentus normally and compare them side by side, you'll see that they both have the same stats, the same implicits, except the one on the right, which is legendary, has an additional affix on it, the 24% increased health, and the unique does not. So that's what legendary potential and Weaver's potential does. It allows you to add additional affixes. In the case of legendaries, or in normal uniques, the number on the legendary potential is the number of affixes that you can add. So you can have anywhere from 0 added affixes if there's nothing else there, or you can do 3 added affixes if it's 3 LP, or up to 4 if it's 4 LP. So sometimes these weapons can have a crazy amount of added affixes, and it keeps the default as well, which answers a very important question, which is pretty true, is that unless you don't have other options, for the most part, legendaries are just going to be better than exalted. However, if there's not a good you know, unique item stat that you can include on a item, in some cases you may just run like an actual exalted item for extra stats there. But in general, having a item that you can add additional stats to while keeping the base item stats on it, essentially legendary is just the implicits that come with the item normally are just going to be the effects of that unique item, but you can still have up to 4 affixes as if it were a non-unique item stacked up once you can completely perfectly roll it at the end game. Now, the major difference between Weaver's Will and the legendary potential is legendary potential you can craft by going to the Temporal Sanctum, finishing the run on the Temporal Sanctum, and will allow you to take a exalted item and roll anywhere from 1 to 4 stats onto the unique in a one-time process that will consume the legendary potential and give you those extra affixes on the on the stat. By the way, do at least tier 2 of the Temporal Sanctum. It is a dungeon that you'll find in the bottom left over here. You just want to come down here, teleport here, complete this. You will need a key to enter. So once you use this, you'll enter a Temporal Sanctum key. You can even teleport straight to the boss, which allows you to craft the item right away for Portal Charm by just using that, or you can just do the key and do the dungeon yourself if you're trying to find the item. So you would take a item that has the same base stats. So for example, I could take this legendary potential 1 Wings of Argentus. I could take this Mystic Plate because they're both chest pieces, and I could run that through Temporal Sanctum and combine them together, and with 1 LP it will grab one of these stats and put it on the Wings of Argentus, making it become legendary. And that one is locked in, and those are your kind of best in slot items. However, Weaver's Will has a potential to be better than that, just because it is very hard to get a perfectly rolled exalted item that has forging potential on it. By the way, you can't transfer the stats if the item itself has 0 forging potential. So even if you get a perfectly rolled exalted item that has 4 of the best stats you can possibly get, if it runs out of forging potential before you can copy it, you get kind of screwed. So that prevents you from, you know, spending all the forging potential making a perfect item and then doing that. It needs to have at least 1 FP on it to transfer over. The difference here is that with Weaver's Will, this is a random process. You don't get to choose the stats, but it will upgrade those stats the amount of times listed on it. So if you have like a Weaver's Will 18 or 20 or 5 or whatever it is, like I have here's a 21. So this one would roll 21 times to either add a stat or upgrade a stat. So you'll notice like on this item here, I have a tier 7, a tier 3, a tier 4, and a tier 2. Those can all be rolled by the Weaver's Will. And the Weaver's Will goes up to maximum, by the way. Your best case scenario is to have a Weaver's Will 28, which is 7 times 4. And in that case, you would get 4 tier 7 stats rolled on a unique item in addition to the normal unique stats. However, you don't get to choose what the stats are. So if you get like a 22 to 28 Weaver's Will item, it could be much better than an LP item because you don't have to find the exalted item that has the perfect stats on it initially. You can just, get those on there. You just don't get to choose what those are. So regardless, you can just run these and equip them and use them, and to kind of get that extra value on if it's a Weaver's Will item. By the way, every item in the game, currently, at least in this season, is either Weaver's Will or Legendary Potential. There are no items, as far as I'm aware, that can be either or. They're either marked preordained before you even get them. That item is always going to be a Weaver's Will item, or it's always going to be an LP item, which I imagine they're going to change from season to season, but that's just how we are sitting right now. So if it's a Weaver's Will item, it's always going to be a Weaver's Will. LP, always LP. Now, one of the downsides with the Weaver's Will item is that in order to consume the Weaver's Will value, you have to equip and use the item. So you actually have to have it on you and then get XP using the item in order to get the Weaver's Will to process. Every time you get XP from killing monsters, it'll has a chance to level up the Weaver's Will, and you can have that process down until it's 0 and you run out of Weaver's Will and you have all your stats on that item. But you have to have it equipped in order to use it and see the Weaver's Will go down, which is kind of lame, right? Because it might ruin your build. So there is another way to get Weaver's Will to level up, and that is by using the Weaver, or the Rune of Weaving. So if I take a Weaver's Will item, I put it in here and I stick in a Weaver's Will, even though this is a unique and I can't craft on it, this will allow you to consume the Weaver's Will and add stats to the item. So I'll just show you and kind of use this up here. So Weaver's Will, you hit Weave. It uses a random amount of Weaver's Will, which is your crafting potential on the item, and you can just keep using these until you max it out and you get all the stats you want, or at least all the stats to see what they're going to turn into, and then you're done, and that saves you the time. You probably won't have a crazy amount of these Rune of Weaving, but it's enough where if you get a high Weaver's Will item and you don't want to equip it and run it for an hour trying to level it up, you can just use the Rune of Weaving to do that for you, so you don't have to equip it to see what the stats are. So now that we understand affixes and their tiers, we understand the rarities of the blue, yellow, and purple items that have the great stats on them, but no unique bonuses. We understand the unique rarity as well as the legendary rarity, Weaver's Will versus legendary potential and forging potential. Let's talk about all these sweet modifiers that we can use to alter our craft and create the item that we're looking for, namely the Modifier Runes and the support Glyphs, which will go in these 2 into slots as you're going through and crafting items. So we already talked about the Rune of Shattering. This is how you dismantle items and get shards for the affixes that they have. The next rune is going to be the Rune of Refinement. This one is going to be used, they have to have potential of them, obviously, but it rerolls the values of all affixes on an item within their tiers. This one you're not going to use as much. This one is pretty rare in its function because remember, this does cost forging potential to do this. So what you do is if you have the 4 affixes you're looking for on an item, but they just don't have good rolls within their tier. So if you go here, you can see the range value. So you'll see that the elemental damage on this item ranges between 6% and 11% for tier 1. This rolled 7, which is towards the end. You could use a Rune of Refinement to re-roll all the stats. If you feel like all the stats on there are just kind of on the lower end of the range, you can use a Rune of Refinement to re-roll. However, again, because it does cost forging potential, you're not going to do this as much as you'll be more likely trying to replace. But if you happen to have a super good item that has the affixes on it that you want, you might roll this just to get those ranges higher, especially if it has, you know, 1 or 2 exalted stats on them that you want to be really, really high. Like you want to scale those stats up like crazy. You may actually end up re-rolling the stats on there. Next to that is the Rune of Removal, which is a super useful but also incredibly risky rune that you'll use probably in the first half of your end game process to try and make the item better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to buy one of these blue items that has some affixes on it. So if we swap that in here, it has 14 forging potential again. And this again only has 2 prefixes, but no suffixes. So normally when you get an item that is missing affixes, you can add whatever affix you want by either deterministically crafting the stat that you're looking for on the suffixes. So I can slap that in there and craft in a stat that I'm looking for. However, that doesn't solve the problem if you have an exalted item that drops with 4 stats on it already. So what do I do if I want to replace an existing stat? I'm not trying to add them with, like, you know, just adding in stats. I need to remove one or replace one in order to get a different stat on that item. So there's 2 primary ways to do that you'll be doing again in your like first half of endgame crafting. The first one is going to be with the Rune of Removal. So if you have an item that has 4 affixes on it already and you don't want to try and replace these, you can use a Rune of Removal. This will target all of the affixes on the item, and when you hit remove an affix, it will randomly, 25% chance for one of these 4 stats, it will randomly remove the item and give you the shards equal to the stat. So it's kind of like shattering. It gives you some shards for that stat, but it will randomly remove one. So say you have an item here that has, like, you know, has HP percent, you know, main stat, and then it has like a really bad stat that you don't want. You have a 1 in 4 chance with the Rune of Removal of just completely removing that stat from the item so that you can manually replace it, which is kind of ideal because again, if you're missing affixes on an item, you can then choose what affixes you want to add to it. So that would be your way of removing an item from that as well. However, if you are able to upgrade the stat, you have another option in the Glyphs portion. So these are runes, this is Glyphs. You can go to the Glyph of Chaos. What this does is that if you are upgrading an affix, so this one that we just talked about, the Rune of Removal, this doesn't have any requirement. You don't have to be targeting an affix. You can just put this in. As long as there's forging potential, you can hit the button and it'll remove one of the stats, which gives you room to add a new stat. However, if you have the option of upgrading a stat, and then you can use Glyph of Chaos, then you'll be able to use this here. You'll see next to the stat itself, there's an up arrow here, which allows you to upgrade the stat if it's below tier 5. So in the process of upgrading it, it has a chance to either upgrade the stat or replace it with something new if you're using a Glyph of Chaos. So you have to be able to upgrade the stat in order to replace it. You hit this button, boom, it'll replace the stat instead of upgrading it with a set chance. But you'll notice that since the maximum craftable is tier 5 on that slot, you may end up just upgrading it to tier 5 and never replacing it. You're just running that gambit or gamut with the Glyph of Chaos. Next up is the Rune of Discovery. This one is useful pretty much while you're leveling and not really ever again. So what this does is if you have a lot of stats to add, say you have an item that has like 1 stat on it, like a singular stat. So like, for example, we could take this white item, right? And then we can go and do the Rune of Discovery. This will get grayed out and this will just fill the missing stats on this. So it goes boom. Now all of a sudden it went from a gray item to a yellow item because it just slapped 4 random stats on it. This is useful again while leveling. You can find something that has 1 good implicit on it or 1 stat, and then throw the Rune of Discovery on it to slap a bunch of stats on it. Generally, you're not going to use Forging Potential on this while end game, but it is an option while leveling, and in some rare cases, you might find some use for it while you're doing end game as well. And the last one is Rune of Shaping, at least on this top row before we get to the fancy ones. This one is, again, you want to use it sparingly, but what this does is it allows you to re-roll the implicits on an item. So for example, you can see the implicits on the Cultist Blade. The flat value is usually fixed for all weapons and all items that have that. However, you can see that the bonus melee void damage is not fixed. It ranges from 3 to 9. So if we wanted to, we could use the Rune of Shaping to re-roll the implicit values on an item. This is super useful for some items. Like some items have like increased cooldown recovery. I think I did re-roll this one to have max cooldown recovery on it. There's going to be plenty of these on there that have chance to poison on spell hit, mana cost, increased cooldown recovery for evade, movement speed. If you need to re-roll the implicits on a non-unique item, you can by using the Rune of Shaping. Next, we move on to the bottom row, which are going to be rarer to find comparatively to the top row of runes, but they are also very, very good. The first one to look at is the Rune of Ascendance, and what this rune does, if you put it in, it will destroy the item and create a unique item of the same slot. However, not all uniques in the game can be ascended this way. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to go online and find whatever you're looking for to get the right item in order to get that slot there. I mean, some of them are super useful, like especially when you first start out on a, the start of a league character or a cycle character and you want to get a specific unique from this process. You can actually just buy from the vendor. Like say you're trying to get a specific amulet, for example, you can go to the vendor, and of course he has no amulets, let's say ring. So we can get this blue ring that's just chilling here. We can slap it into the slot, and then we can ascend it to randomly generate a unique ring in the game. Again, not some items are boss drop only, some items are specific location only, but a good fair amount of them are actually craftable this way. So if you're trying to get a specific unique item that you just haven't had drop yet, you can use the Rune of Ascendance. So we can try it, ascend, boom, it turned into a Ring of the Third Eye, and these can actually have legendary potential on them as well when you craft them this way, which is pretty useful. So it is an option for you if you're trying to create specific uniques that you're trying to farm or use. You can just grab those, buy the white or blue version of them, ascend them up into the unique, and that's just another avenue for you to be able to get unique items. Next is your Rune of Creation, which just duplicates an item. This is your Mirror of Calandra. This just duplicates an item. However, there is a stipulation here. This does not work obviously on uniques, because uniques cannot be crafted. They need forging potential to be able to do this. So it has to have forging potential on it. So it's really just for exalted items that are best in slot, perfect, that you want to copy. However, you'll notice that if we do this and we want to duplicate this item, it will cost all of your forging potential. So this Rune of Creation kills the forging potential of the item you're copying and kills the forging potential of the duplicate that it makes. So again, you're making perfect exalted items, but as we talked about earlier, in order to use the legendary potential on a unique to add affixes from an exalted item, the item has to have forging potential, which means you can't get a perfect best in slot item that's exalted, copy it, and then use the copy in order to duplicate. It's just for making best in slot exalted items, which again, not every build is going to be full of legendaries. Some builds you have to make a concession and use exalted items just for the implicits on it that are really important for breakpoints, or maybe you just need specific stats, or there's just not that many good uniques to make legendaries out of for that slot. So that's where that copy item is going to be. These Runes of Creation are very rare. They come around very rarely, so you won't really have to worry about this. And again, they're going to use for making exalted items from that standpoint as well. We already talked about the Rune of Weaving. This is for consuming the Weaver's will on items to make them legendary. And the last two runes here are very important as well. The first one is Rune of Havoc. This one is insane for many reasons. So let's take a exalted item. Let's put it up in here. And what's great about the Rune of Havoc is this will just shift all of the tiers of all of your affixes around. It jumbles them. It doesn't change them, it just jumbles them. So for example, on this item, you'll see that we have a tier 6 vitality, tier 5 mana, tier 3 armor, and tier 4 fire resistance for this. What this will do is it'll shuffle the tiers, has the same exact stats, but it shuffles the tiers of all of them by moving through them. So it could make the tier 6 vitality into a tier 3 from the armor, and then turn fire resistance into tier 6, and then mana into tier 4, and then you could turn armor into tier 5 or something like that. It shuffles them all around. So it could be useful for the first use case, which is incredibly obvious, in that if you have an item, say we go here and we find just a random exalted item that we could use that has, say it has like, you know, tier 7 on this quiver, right? So this quiver, if we were to use this, has tier 5, tier 5, tier 4, and tier 7. However, we don't want the chance to poison on to be tier 7. Maybe we want increased crit chance to be tier 7. And so what you could do is you could slap in the Rune of Havoc and shuffle the tiers to make a different stat, your exalted stat, to make it better. So that's the first use case of Rune of Havoc, which is super useful. If you get an item that's close to being very good, but you want a certain stat to be prioritized over others, it gives you that option. However, you'll notice that if we're not selecting a stat here, one of the problems we identified earlier is that if you can't actually cause an upgrade, like you're not doing an upgrade, you can't do things like Glyph of Chaos, right? Because we need a modifier. You actually need to be doing a process. So you need to be upgrading a stat, replacing a stat, or doing something in order for these glyphs to trigger. The glyphs don't trigger on their own, only the runes do that. So if we go through and we select all of these, none of these glyphs are going to allow us to make a step on this item unless we're doing something. So in the case where you don't have a, like say we upgraded this, right? Like we had this at tier 5. If we took this away, we can just do this here. Boom, I'm gonna upgrade it. Boom. Now it's tier 5, right? So we can clear that out, and that's there. And the affix is now max. So we can take this, put it in. Now I have a problem, right? If I want to continue upgrading this item, or say I want to do like Glyph of Chaos to replace a stat on the item, I can't, because we have 3 tier 5s and a tier 7. None of these can be upgraded. Tier 5 is the maximum craftable upgrade. So I can't do anything to trigger a crafting process to use the Glyph of Chaos unless we use things like Rune of Havoc. Because it technically is a step in the process, it is allowing us to do this. We can use the Rune of Havoc to trigger a Glyph of Chaos to change one of these stats into something else, even though we didn't have anything put down. So that's the other use case for Rune of Havoc, which is super useful. Say you have like this situation here, like you have 1 tier 6, 2 tier 5s, and a tier 7. You can't target any of them to get them to trigger, and you want to change one of them, you can with Rune of Havoc, or you can take this glyph off and you can just do this to replace some of the affixes or shuffle around if you like. Then lastly, you have the Room of Redemption. This changes the exalted affixes on an item into a different affix. Does not change the tiers of the affixes or the rolls within the tiers. So rather than re-rolling this, I was just saving this for a different build that I could use later, but we can throw it away. It's whatever. So let's do this. I'm gonna waste a Rune of Redemption so I can show you what happens here. So we have a Rune of Redemption. This randomly changes only exalted affixes. So on this, we have a tier 5, a tier 5, a tier 5, and a tier 7, which is in purple. So if I hit this and I go boom, you'll notice that it kept the tier 7, but re-rolled only the tier 7 into a different. So when you have a tier 7 or tier 6, a purple exalted affix, this will target just that affix and randomly change it to something else. So in this case, all the tier 5s stayed the same, but the chance to poison turned into elemental resistance, so we'll be able to change that stat there, which is a pretty cool addition, and again, gives you that flexibility to fine-tune an item that might be almost perfect. Maybe this item is like a whole bunch of like tier 5 affixes that you like, and then a tier 7 that, God, it's like max rolled, but it's not the stat you're looking for. Rune of Havoc or Rune of Redemption has you covered. Next, let's go over the glyphs. So these will modify an action that's already happening. So you need to be able to hit this button down at the bottom in order to do it. But these all have various uses. The one you're gonna use the most is the Glyph of Hope. All this does is that it has a chance to cost no forging potential when you do an upgrade. So say we wanted to do this, it'll cost a certain amount of forging potential to do that. There is a 1/4 chance that you will cost no forging potential. So you'll pretty much almost always want to use this if you're not using a different glyph, is if you're doing a process that you can use it on, use it. It has a chance to save you the forging potential on the item, which means you can craft more, which is very, very good. Next is the Glyph of Chaos. We've mentioned this several times already, but if you're already doing an upgrade, the Glyph of Chaos will take the affix that's being upgraded in that stance, it could be a random one if you're upgrading, you know, if it's affecting all of them. It could be a specific stat if you're not, like if there's a stat that can be upgraded, you can target that stat and hit the Glyph of Chaos, which has a chance to change it into a new stat when it goes up, so that you can actually just get a different stat there. Super useful there. The next one is the Glyph of Order. This prevents the roll of an affix within its range changing when it's upgraded. And what that means is that when you look here, you see the range. So like critical strike chance on this quiver ranges from 36% to 50%. If I had a 50% roll on that and I was upgrading it, I might use the Glyph of Order because it means that I have a maximum roll within my tier. If I use Glyph of Order and it goes from tier 4 to tier 5, for example, it'll keep the maximum roll, just move up in the range to keep that there. So if you happen to have a good stat roll on it, like it's max roll on it, then you may want to keep it, and you can use the Glyph of Order for that. Next is the Glyph of Despair, and this has some niche uses that can be super powerful. So what this glyph does, it allows you to have a chance when you upgrade a stat to seal that stat on the item. If you have an item with a sealed affix on it, like this one here, it doesn't exist in the normal set. It'll just appear in the bottom left over here. So notice there is now a sealed stat on this item. This is now outside of the 2 prefix, 2 suffix system, and it stays there. However, you can't transfer sealed affixes, so if you're trying to send this over to a legendary item, it won't travel with it, so it's just only if it stays an exalted item. You can keep the sealed affix on it as well, which is really good for making super strong exalted items if you need to keep them there, because then they can have 5 stats instead of 4, or 5 affixes instead of 4, which is pretty nice. And the last glyph is the Glyph of Envy. This one destabilizes an item, changing all properties other than the affix being upgraded, is siphoned to the most recent monolith timeline you enter, greatly increasing its stability. So this one is your mulligan. You're like, this is not going the way that I thought. I can still upgrade 1 stat, but boy, it's just not going well. I'm going to change all properties other than the affix being upgraded on this item, siphon the stability to the last timeline that you use to get extra timeline stability there if you really need to, though not really necessary. I don't think anyone really uses these, to be honest. There are some very specific situations where you might want to, but in general, you don't really need to farm stability this way, and it does give you the affix properties, non-affix properties being changed as well. So that's kind of like your mulligan if you really think things aren't going well or you have no other options. So this video is already super long, but there's one more thing that I want to cover. So rather than going into like advanced crafting strategies or all that, let's cover the last area of crafting in the current state of the game, and that is going to be with your woven echoes. So outside of all of your runes, all of your glyphs, finding the right affixes or the right rarity between exalted, unique, or legendary, you have more options for controlling the stats on an item or controlling the crafting of them using the new woven echoes. So when you go into your timelines, you will be able to add in the special webby echoes into your timeline, and each one of those has different items that drop, guaranteed bonuses. You can get like special loot, you can get specific, like, you know, this one always drops unique armor. You can get things that drop, you know, gear for a specific class if you want. However, some of these woven echoes actually have a crafting purpose, so by completing them, you'll be able to create items or change items. So let's just walk through these. The first one I think is really important for most builds is going to be the collapsing horizon. This is more of a farming strategy, so we won't go too deep on it, but this one is one that I use a lot in my timelines, especially now when I'm trying to farm like specific items. What this does is when this appears, the collapsing horizon, either by adding it through the Weaver's Tree or by adding it through the cemeteries, this will spawn a harbinger that drops or has a chance to drop the loot from that timeline's boss. So you can actually add a bunch of these to your echo web and be able to do these over and over, and this one will actually allow you to farm boss drops. So if there's something that drops from the boss of a timeline, you can run this echo over and over and over and get the boss drop without having to push all the way to the boss and defeat it. Next is going to be the Farsight Turtle. It is in the third rarity of the woven echoes, but this one's super nice. What this does is it has a chance to change the legendary potential on a unique item. It randomly either increases it or decreases it, and it's rolled the same way as it would if it it just freshly dropped. And, you know, because 0 is the most common, 1's a little less common, and it gets lower and lower to the point where 3 LP and 4 LP are exceptionally rare. It's the same thing, but if you have an item that you really want to re-roll the LP on, you can run the Farsight Turtle, and then once you're at the end, you can then re-roll the LP on a unique, and you might get lucky. Among the final rarity is the Gauntlet of Strife. This one is super awesome. So what this does, it will actually allow you to go to the sacrificial altar once you're done with the Echo, and here you can sacrifice. It has to be a 1-to-1 copy, so you need 2 of the same unique to do this. So you like run like a swaddling and a swaddling or something like that, or a nib and a nib. You put those together, and what it'll do is it'll sacrifice 1 copy of the unique to re-roll the properties on the other. So if you have one, it always needs to be, so like for example, if we're talking about like Weaver's Will or Legendary Potential, you can't take a Legendary Potential 3 and re-roll it using an item that's a Legendary Potential 1, right? Like it has to be equal value or higher, but it means that if you have a really good value item and you have one that rolled poorly, you can take one that has equal Weaver's Will or more, put those both in there together and say, we have like this Weaver's Will item that rolled stats that you may not want. Like I don't need minion damage on this one, so we can re-roll that. You can go over to the Gauntlet of Strife, take 2 of the same item that have, as long as the sacrifice item has equal or more potential, you can sacrifice 1 item to re-roll the unique on the other, which gives you a chance to get different legendary stats or different passives on it, which is pretty useful. The next one that's super important to think about, you need to have this on your radar, is Orden's Watch. This is a dual timeline, King of the Hill style mode, but when you finish it, you gain access to the Altar of Fate. And what this does, it allows you to change the main stat on an item. So for example, if this item, it's like this item here has, that one won't work. This one has intelligence on it, right? So these boots here have 7 intelligence. What you do is when you complete Orden's Watch is you can put the item into the altar and select an item that has strength or intelligence or dexterity or attunement on it and swap that stat to one of the other 3. This is massive. It does cost you in order to do so, but it means that, say this has intelligence on it and you want it to have dexterity, or it has strength on it and you want it to have intelligence or something like that, run the Orden's Watch and replace it. And you need to know about this because if you have an item that you're looking at that has like everything's perfect except it has the wrong main stat, like say you're running like a sentinel build that needs strength and you get an item that everything about it is perfect except that it rolled dexterity, you can then go to Orden's Watch and replace the dexterity with strength if you want, which opens up a lot of opportunities for some very good items. Then there's 3 Woven Echoes, which aren't going to be the end all be all. They aren't like the most perfect solution, but they can result in some decent items and you need to be aware of what they are. The first one is here, the Conquered Tower. This is just a climbing tower that allows you to do multiple Nemesis encounters in a row. If you've never done a Nemesis, it is the like void sword planted in the ground. You're able to place items into it. So just for the sake of this video, I ran out and found a Nemesis because I think it's pretty important that people understand how they work in order to get them. So you'll find a Nemesis. They look like this. It's like this rip in space-time. You'll see on the map as well as this like little lion emblem icon. When you click on it, it will randomly have 4 items available for you to use. You have a choice to banish the Nemesis, which will destroy it. The next time you encounter a Nemesis, it will be a brand new set of items. You can challenge the Nemesis, which means it'll drop everything it has listed here, or you can choose to empower it, which will randomly make all of these items stronger in some way, which will allow you to get more value. So if it's a unique, it'll add in legendary potential. Sometimes it'll even make a unique into a legendary item and choose the legendary stat for you in general. But Nemesis are incredibly powerful because they give you the option to farm very good items. You can end up getting, like, you can see this one has 2 tier 6 rolls on it. This one has a tier 6 as well. You can get like some crazy value out of these if you keep rolling them. However, the best part about the Nemesis system is the Nemesis egg. When you first encounter a fresh Nemesis, it has a chance to have an egg slot here. And what that means is that there will be a change button underneath it. You can hit the change button and then you can put any legendary item that doesn't have any legendary potential on it. So any unique item with no LP on it, you can slap it in the egg and empower it, and then you'll be able to go through the Nemesis process on that as well. So if you have items, like you're trying to get a specific unique to turn into legendary. Right now I'm working on Wings of Argentus, so I put a 0 LP Wings of Argentus into the egg earlier. I empowered it and added 1 LP to an item that had 0 LP, which is pretty cool, but it's a great way to farm a whole bunch of one unique if you need to. And what's great about the Echo that we talked about, this one here, the Conquered Tower, is it has like 5 Nemesis in it and then a boss at the end. So you can run through and you can keep using the Nemesis egg to craft new versions of the same item, or you can just run Nemesis over and over to try and get better items that drop from it. It is a great source of loot, and if you're trying to do Nemesis specifically, Conquered Tower is an excellent Echo for that. The next one is kind of an interesting one. It is this one here, the Great Bridge, in the bottom left of the lowest rarity. What this does is it allows you to access the Forge of Fates, which means you can shatter set items to get shards for that set item and then craft new ones. Currently, in this current state, we don't have like a lot of builds that use set items. You can play around with crafting, and it is a new way for them to be able to make an item into a set item. But in general, I haven't seen anyone play with this. If you have some cool ideas or experience with using the new set shattering process, I just haven't found anything worthwhile in doing so, but it is an option for crafting. And the other one is going to be the one that allows you to craft experimental items, which is the Rune Prison Complex. So if you fight the runed mages or the prisoned mages, they will drop items that have experimental stats on them, which is a whole nother list of items to look at. So the experimental items have this split color to them. So you'll notice that like these two next to each other, this one is a normal exalted item and this one is experimental stat on it. So you'll see that like, you know, it has this like half triangle with that little border that goes around it on the side there, and it accesses the experimental affixes, which cannot be crafted, and you can't craft experimental stats onto an item, and you can't get shards out of them as well, and they don't transfer either. So if you're trying to make a really, really good exalted item with the affixes, they do crazy things that don't exist on normal stats. They are completely different from everything else in the game. So if you want to play around with experimental items, again, kind of a cool thing that you could do to create something new. They have some wacky stuff like drain health, or you know, your health drains constantly, but you generate ward because of it, and you can get armor mitigation applies to your damage over time, and it gives you armor and stuff. There's some cool things that you can do with it, and there is a woven echo, the Rune Prison Echo, which allows you to create experimental affixes, which is useful if you want to go down that road. But that's it. The video is way too long as it is, so I'm going to stop it there, but hopefully this covers all the crafting systems, all of the functions, things you need to know, stipulations and requirements and all that, so you have a better understanding of how crafting works in Last Epoch, because it's definitely one of the better crafting systems out there in most like gear-based games, and understanding it I think is a big part of being able to get all the way to Uber Aberoth and beyond. If there's other topics you want me to cover, let me know down below in the comments. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.